Say it again, Josie, and I'll finish what I started on the steps of God's own house. Her husband's grip closed white-knuckled around her wrist, and the whole of Split Creek Sunday congregation stood not 10 feet away and found something urgent to study in the dirt, unaware that the quiet stranger stepping between them was the most hunted gunslinger west of the Pecos. To a man, the newspapers in 3 territories had already buried twice and been wrong both times. This is the story of Josie Cordell. Autumn of 1884, Split Creek in the Arizona Territory, a woman 2 years deep into a marriage that had already cost her everything but her name, and the drifter who walked into the one corner of town where nobody was supposed to interfere. If a story like this gets its hooks into you the way it got into me, go ahead and subscribe before we start, and tell me in the comments what town you're watching from tonight. I like knowing how far a story like this travels before it's done. Now, let's go back to the beginning, to the morning it started, because it didn't start on the church steps at all. It started 3 years earlier, in a parlor that smelled like lemon oil and good intentions. Josie Unset had been 17 when Emmett Cordell first came calling, and she had been, by every account, Split Creek was willing to give the prettiest girl the town had produced in a decade. Her father ran the mercantile on Bannock Street and owed money to half the ranchers in the valley, a fact Emmett Cordell knew before he ever tipped his hat to her, because knowing things about people was how Emmett Cordell had built everything he owned. He owned the feed store and half the freight line, and a piece of the bank besides, and when he came calling on the Unset girl with flowers bought special from Prescott, the whole town treated it like weather, like something you didn't argue with, because arguing with weather had never once changed it. Her father had wept with relief the night Emmett proposed, actual tears, because it meant the debt would be forgiven and the family would be spoken of kindly again. And Josie had stood in the parlor doorway and watched her own future get settled by 2 men who never once turned to ask her opinion of it. She married him in the spring, in a dress her mother had taken in twice, because Josie had gone thin with the dread of it, though nobody named it dread out loud. Everyone named it nerves instead. The Reverend Talmadge Weir, who had baptized her, who had known her since she was a girl in pigtails reciting scripture for a peppermint, stood up at that wedding and pronounced the union blessed. And if he saw the particular stillness in the way Josie held her shoulders, the first time Emmett struck her was 4 months into the marriage over a supper she had made wrong, though she could never afterward remember what precisely had been wrong about it, only that his hand had come across the table faster than thought, and that the sound it made against her cheek was smaller than she expected, almost polite, and that he had apologized within the hour with a brooch from the mercantile, and a voice gone soft and reasonable, telling her that a man under the pressures he carried needed a wife who understood him, and that she would learn, and that he loved her more than any man in that territory could love a woman. She believed him for the better part of a year, because believing him was easier than the alternative, which was admitting that the life she'd been handed was a cage built out of good china. By the 2nd year she had stopped believing him and started merely surviving him, which was a different skill entirely, one built out of reading the weather in his shoulders when he came through the door, out of knowing which words set him off and which ones bought her an evening's peace, out of learning to fold herself smaller in rooms so there was less of her for his temper to find. She had 2 friends left in Split Creek who would still talk to her plainly, a laundress named Odalise Pruitt who had buried a husband of her own and recognized the signs the way a woman recognizes weather she's already survived, and a boy of 19, Casper Rule, who worked the livery and had loved Josie hopelessly and silently since they were children, a devotion he kept sealed behind his teeth, because voicing it would have gotten him killed, and he knew it. The town, for its part, had made its peace with Emmett Cordell's temper, the way towns make their peace with a bad well, or a road that floods every spring, which is to say they built their lives around it. Sheriff Otis Bramwell had been elected twice, with Emmett's money behind him, and owed his badge and his boots and probably his marriage bed to Cordell Freight Contracts. And when Odalis Pruitt had come to him 8 months back with a description of the bruise she'd seen on Josie's collarbone, was that a marriage was a private country and the law didn't carry a passport into it, not unless somebody ended up dead, and even then he'd want to see the body first. The Reverend Weir preached forgiveness and the sanctity of the vow from his pulpit every Sunday, and had, on more than one occasion, reminded Josie, even her own mother, when Josie had finally worked up the nerve to say some small true thing about her marriage over tea, only patted her hand with the old comfortable line that all husbands had their moods that Emmett provided. That provision was most of what love ever really was for a woman built the way the world built women. And that Josie should be grateful and quiet and grateful again. So she had gone quiet. She had learned the particular quiet of a woman who has run out of people to tell, and she wore it the way she wore her wedding ring, as a fact of her life rather than a choice she'd made. And if you had passed her on Bannock Street in the fall of 1884, and you would have thought, if you thought anything at all, that Split Creek had a fine-looking Mrs. Cordell and moved on with your day the way the whole town had learned to move on, because moving on was so much easier than looking straight at what was happening in that fine house on Cattleman's Row. There were small mercies in that house, and Josie had learned to hoard them, the way a woman hoards anything scarce. Emmett was gone 3 days out of every 7 on freight business, riding the line between Split Creek and the railhead at Ash Fork, and those were the days Josie lived for, the days she could sit on the back step shelling beans in the sun, the days she could walk to the mercantile and speak with her father without measuring every word first for what it might cost her later. She had taken, in the 2nd year, to keeping a small tin box beneath a loose floorboard under the bed, and into it she put whatever coin she could skim unnoticed from the household accounts, a nickel here, a dime there, not because she had any plan yet for what the money was for, only because some stubborn animal instinct in her demanded one door stay open, however narrow, that Emmett did not know existed. Odalis Pruitt knew about the tin box. Odalis had helped her count it once, the two of them bent together over the boards by lamplight while Emmett snored off a Saturday's whiskey down the hall, and her verdict, delivered in the plain, unhurried way she gave most of her opinions, was that a woman who kept a door open long enough sometimes found she had the nerve to walk through it, and that nerve, done like love, could be built up slow, a coin at a time, same as the tin box. Emmett's cruelty was not constant, and that was, in its own way, the crueler fact of it, because a constant cruelty a person could brace against, could organize a whole life around, avoiding. But Emmett's temper came and went, like weather off the Mogollon Rim, sudden and specific, and gone again by morning, replaced by a version of him that could be genuinely, disarmingly tender, that remembered her birthday and brought her ribbon from Prescott, and in the hushed voice of a man confessing something sacred, swore that she was the only good thing he'd ever managed to hold on to. It was that second Emmett, the tender one, that made the whole arrangement so difficult to name even to herself, because loving a monster is a simple horror, but loving a man who is only sometimes a monster, who spends just enough of himself on kindness to keep you reaching for it, is a slower and more particular kind of ruin. And Josie had spent 2 years unable to decide which Emmett was the true one and which was the mask, until she finally understood somewhere in the depths of that second year that the question itself was the trap, that a man was the sum of what he did, and not merely the best of what he sometimes managed. Once she'd let herself see it plainly, had cost her something she couldn't get back. A kind of hope she hadn't known she'd been rationing until it ran out entirely. The stranger came into Split Creek on the second Sunday of October, riding a dun gelding that had seen hard miles and carrying nothing that marked him as anything but a drifter passing through on his way to somewhere less particular. He wore his gun low but not showy, the holster worn soft with use rather than polished for effect, and he had the kind of face that didn't ask to be remembered, sun-browned and quiet, with pale eyes that took in a room without seeming to look at anything directly. The name he gave the liveryman Casper Rule was Wade, nothing more, and he paid in advance for a week's board for the horse and himself, mentioning only that he was headed north to Flagstaff on business he didn't specify. Casper, who had a young man's instinct for trouble, clocked that Wade's saddlebags were heavier than a drifter's bags had any right to be, and clocked, too, the way the man's eyes had gone to every exit in the livery within the first 10 words. Then an old buffalo hunter who'd survived a massacre nobody talked about anymore. Wade had not planned to stop in Split Creek at all. He had meant to water his horse and be gone by mid-afternoon, because stopping longer than a few hours in any one town had become, over the years, a habit as dangerous to him as an unloaded gun, a comfort he no longer allowed himself. He had learned that lesson the hard way outside a dusty crossing named Piedra Roja 2 winters back, where he had lingered 4 days over a girl who ran a boarding house and a bowl of stew that reminded him of a mother he barely remembered, and the girl's boarding house had taken 2 bullets meant for Wade through its front window, and though she'd lived, Wade had not stopped 4 days anywhere since, not until Split Creek, not until a woman in a gray dress on a church step gave him a reason his own rules couldn't talk him out of. He had grown in the years since the Larrabee business outside Socorro into a particular kind of tired that had nothing to do with miles in the saddle. It was the tiredness of a man who had never once gone looking for the reputation that followed him, who had killed the first time to save his own life and the second time to save a stranger's, and who watched, with a kind of sick fascination, as each killing bought him not peace but more attention. More young fools, eager to make a name off the man who'd made a name off men before him. He had come to think of himself less as a gunslinger than as a wound the territory kept picking at, and he rode from town to town now mostly hoping to find one that would let the wound close. Wade had meant to be through Split Creek within the day. He had business north, a debt owed him by a man in Flagstaff who thought distance made a debt forgivable, and he had learned patience the hard way, the way men learn it who have spent years hunted for a reputation they never wanted. Split Creek did not yet know it, and would not know it for some while longer, but he was a man named in wanted bills from El Paso to the Colorado line under 6 descriptions that all agreed on one detail, that he was faster and colder than any account of him could capture. A gunman who had ended the Larrabee gang single-handed outside Socorro 2 winters back, and walked away from 4 Pinkerton contracts since, not because he sought the killing, but because the killing sought him, following him from town to town like a debt collector who never stopped adding interest. He had come to hate what his hands were known for. He had come, in the quiet hours on the trail, to want nothing so much as a town that would let him pass through unremembered, and Split Creek, on the morning he rode in, looked for all the world like exactly that kind of town. He had gone to the little Methodist church out of habit more than faith, the way a man raised strict sometimes finds himself in a pew from old muscle memory, even when he no longer believes the words. And he had sat in the back row through Reverend Weir's sermon on patience and forbearance, and he had watched without meaning to watch anything at all. A young woman in a gray dress sitting stiff as a fence post 3 rows up, flinching very slightly every time her husband shifted beside her. A flinch so small and so practiced that most of the congregation had long since stopped seeing it. Wade had seen it because Wade had spent years learning to read the smallest movements in a room, the tell in a hand before it goes for iron, the held breath before a lie. And what he read in that gray dress was a woman keeping herself very still so as not to be struck in the house of God. The trouble came after, on the church steps in the thin gold light of a Sunday noon, with half the town still filing out into the yard. Nobody agreed afterward on precisely what set Emmett off, whether Josie had spoken too long with Odalus Pruitt at the door, or laughed at something Casper Rule offered while helping her down the steps, and Emmett himself would never give an accounting that made sense to anyone but him, because the truth was simpler and uglier than any story. Which was that Emmett Cordell did not need a reason, he needed only the itch, and the itch had been building in him since Friday. He caught her wrist on the 3rd step down, hard enough that she gasped, and when she tried to pull free, he struck her open-handed across the face in front of the Reverend, in front of the sheriff's own wife, in front of 30 God-fearing souls who had just finished singing a hymn about mercy. And the sound of it cracked flat across the churchyard like a dropped plate. Josie went down against the step, one hand catching the rail, and Emmett was on her before she found her feet again, a fist closing in the collar of her dress, and it was then, with his hand already drawn back for a second blow, that the words came, the ones that would follow him the rest of his short remaining life, low enough that only she and the man 3 steps below them could hear it clean. "Say it again, Josie, and I'll finish what I started on the steps of God's own house." And the whole of Split Creek's Sunday congregation, every soul who owed Emmett Cordell a debt or a job or a vote, found the dirt at their feet suddenly fascinating. And not one of them moved, because moving had never once helped before, and every one of them had long since decided it wasn't worth the trying. Wade moved. He did not remember afterward deciding to. He crossed the yard the way he crossed a room before a gunfight, without hurry, and without hesitation both at once. And he caught Emmett's cocked arm at the wrist, with a grip that made the bigger man's knees buckle from the sheer unexpected force of it. His voice, pitched low enough to carry only between the two of them, delivered a single, flat fact. A man didn't get a second swing at a woman while he was standing there to see it. Emmett Cordell, who had not been refused anything in Split Creek in a decade, looked into pale eyes that gave him nothing at all to work with, no fear, no anger even, just a terrible patience, and some old animal part of him understood before his pride caught up that he had put his hand on the wrong stranger's mourning. The congregation had gone dead silent. Reverend Weir found his voice first, urging peace, urging the Lord's patience, urging Wade in particular to remember himself in a house of worship. And Sheriff Bramwell came down the steps with his hand resting meaningfully on his own belt. Wade let go of Emmett's wrist, slow and deliberate, the way you set down something you don't trust yourself not to break. and he looked at the sheriff, and he looked at the reverend, and he looked last at Josie, who had gotten to her feet with her hand pressed to a cheek already going pink and her eyes wide with something that wasn't quite gratitude, because gratitude required believing the interruption would last, and said only that he'd be in town through the week at the boarding house on 3rd if anyone had further business with him about it. Then he picked up his hat from where it had fallen in the dust and walked back toward the livery, and the whole yard watched him go, the way a herd watches a wolf that hasn't decided yet whether it's hungry. That night, in the parlor on Cattleman's Row, Emmett Cordell did not touch his wife, which Josie had learned over 2 years to read as its own kind of threat, a held breath before worse weather, and instead he sat with a bottle of Kentucky whiskey and asked her, in a voice gone soft and reasonable the way it always went soft and reasonable in the hour after, who exactly that stranger thought he was, putting his hands on a married man in front of God and the whole congregation. Josie said she didn't know. It was true. She had spent 2 years learning not to know things out loud, because knowing things out loud had a cost in that house. And she went to bed early and lay listening to the house settle and did not sleep, turning over in her mind the particular stillness in the stranger's pale eyes. A stillness she recognized, because she had spent 2 years cultivating a version of it herself, though hers was born of fear and his, she suspected without knowing why, was born of something else entirely. Word of what happened on the church steps traveled through Split Creek before supper was cold in half its houses, and by Monday morning the town had settled into its 2 familiar camps, the larger one holding that the stranger had overstepped badly and would answer for it one way or another. Mostly the ones who had noticed things about the Cordell marriage they'd never said aloud, who found themselves thinking about the drifter with something that felt dangerously close to hope. Odalise Pruitt was among the second camp, and she found Wade that Monday at the boarding house with a basket of mending as her excuse, and she told him plainly because she had decided plainness was owed to a man who'd stepped where nobody else would, that what he'd seen on the church steps was not a single bad morning, but 2 years of a slow killing that the whole town had agreed to call a marriage. Wade listened the way he listened to everything without interrupting, and when she finished, he asked her only one question, which was whether Josie had anywhere to go if she left, and Odalise, who had turned the question over in her own mind 100 times without ever finding an answer, told him that a woman in the territory who left her husband left with nothing, not the house, not the standing, not even, in a town this size, the benefit of the doubt. Casper Rule came to Wade separately, on Tuesday, with the loose-limbed nervousness of a young man about to say something that might get him in trouble, and told him that Emmett Cordell had ridden out Monday afternoon to his brother's spread on the Verde, and that Emmett's brother was Dutch Cordell, who ran cattle and a good deal else in the county and had, in his younger years, ridden with men whose names weren't spoken in polite company. Casper had grown up hearing stories about Dutch Cordell that made Emmett look, by comparison, almost mild. And he told Wade this not because he expected the stranger to run, though running would have been the sensible thing, but because he thought a man ought to know what he'd stepped into before it stepped back. Casper's own history with the Cordell family ran deeper than he let on that first Tuesday. His father had worked freight for Emmett Cordell for 6 years before a wagon accident on the Ash Fork Road left him with a leg that never healed right, and Emmett had docked his father's pay for every week he couldn't ride, then let him go entirely the winter. The leg finally gave out for good, with no more ceremony than a man discarding a worn harness. Casper had been 14 that winter, old enough to understand exactly what his family's poverty afterward had cost them, and old enough to hate Emmett Cordell with a clean, uncomplicated hatred that had only sharpened over the years he'd watched Josie Unsett become Josie Cordell, disappeared inside his ruined leg. He had never said any of this to Josie herself, because saying it would have meant admitting how long and how uselessly he'd loved her, but he said enough of it to Wade that Tuesday that Wade understood the boy would stand and fight if it came to that, whether Wade wanted him to or not. Only unspoken, which was its own kind of tragedy. There was a third voice in Split Creek that Tuesday who mattered more than the town yet knew, and that was Dr. Amos Fielding, who had tended Josie twice in the past 2 years for injuries she'd described both times as falls, a wrenched shoulder the first winter of her marriage and 2 cracked ribs the spring after, and who had written both times in his ledger the word he was given rather than the word his examination told him was true, because a doctor in a town the size of Split Creek who called a leading citizen's wife a liar to her husband's face. Fielding had carried the weight of those 2 false entries for a year and better, and when word reached his office of what had happened on the church steps, he closed his ledger, poured himself a drink he didn't usually take before supper, and told his wife that he intended, the next time anyone asked him a direct question about Josie Cordell's health, to answer it honestly, whatever it cost him, a small and private penance that would matter more than he yet knew. Wade had, by then, already made up his mind to stay a while longer than his business north strictly required, though he would not have called it a decision so much as a debt he recognized in himself, the particular debt a man owes when he's spent years running from what he is and finally finds a use for it that doesn't feel like a curse. He rode out past the Cordell freight yard that same Tuesday, not to make trouble, only to look, and what he saw confirmed Casper's account, 3 hired men he didn't recognize, hard-looking and idle in the way men are idle when they're paid to wait for trouble rather than work. A bounty tracker named Silas Junger he'd crossed paths with once before in the Nations, which told Wade that his own name, whatever name Split Creek would eventually put to him, had already started traveling faster than he wanted it to. Josie, meanwhile, lived through that week the way she had learned to live through every week, watching Emmett's moods for the shift in weather, though something in her had changed since the church steps that she couldn't yet name. A small stubborn ember of the girl who used to laugh clean across a churchyard, kindled by nothing more than the memory of a stranger's hand closing around her husband's wrist, and the words he'd said, after, that a man didn't get a second swing while he was standing there to see it. She found herself, twice that week, walking past the boarding house on 3rd on invented errands, and both times she did not stop, because stopping would have been its own kind of confession. But she looked. And both times he touched his hat to her without a word, and both times something in her chest that had been clenched for 2 years loosened by the smallest fraction. If a story like this has ever made you sit up a little straighter in your chair, this is a good place to hit that subscribe button, because there's more of this particular kind of reckoning coming, and I promise you the second half of Josie's story is the part people remember. Now back to Split Creek, because the following Sunday was the one that changed everything. Emmett Cordell had spent the week between Sundays doing what men like Emmett always did when their pride took a public wound, which was to make it someone else's fault, and to make that someone pay for the making. He had gone to Sheriff Bramwell and demanded the stranger be run out of town for public assault, though there were 30 witnesses who'd seen exactly whose hand had struck first, and Bramwell, who owed his badge to Cordell money, riding out to the boarding house to inform Wade that his presence in Split Creek was no longer welcome past the weekend. Wade had received this news the way he received most things, without argument and without any visible change in his plans, which unsettled Bramwell considerably more than an argument would have, because a man who didn't fight back against being run off was either a coward, and Bramwell had seen the man's eyes on the church steps and knew coward wasn't the word, or he was a man who had already decided the ultimatum didn't apply to him. Emmett had also in that week taken his grievance to his brother Dutch, and Dutch Cordell, who had not troubled himself over his younger brother's domestic affairs in some years, found himself curious about a stranger with the nerve to lay hands on a Cordell in daylight, and curious men like Dutch Cordell had a habit of turning curiosity into inquiry. And inquiry, in the case of a man who'd once ridden with rougher company than most of the territory knew about, meant sending word to men who made a business of knowing who other men really were. It took until Thursday for an answer to come back, carried by the bounty tracker Silas Junger, who arrived at the Cordell Ranch on the Verde with a folded newspaper clipping from a Socorro paper 18 months stale, a quiet drifter currently boarding on 3rd Street in Split Creek under the name Wade. Dutch Cordell read that clipping twice, and what he read there was not, as Emmett had hoped, grounds for driving the stranger off in disgrace, but something considerably more useful to a man of Dutch's particular practicality. With one of the deadliest gunmen currently walking free in the territory, a man wanted in 3 jurisdictions and credited, depending which account you believed, with anywhere from 6 to 19 kills, none of them, so far as any paper had ever proven, a man who hadn't drawn first. Dutch understood immediately that this was no longer a matter of a wife's discipline or a town's pride. It was a matter of a Cordell having embarrassed himself in front of a legend, and legends, once embarrassed, had an unfortunate habit of finishing the conversation they'd started. Silas Junger, for his part, had his own reasons for delivering that clipping personally, rather than by letter, because Silas Junger made his living on bounty paper, and had spent the better part of 2 years chasing rumors of this, and he had begun to suspect, with the bitter professional frustration of a hunter who senses his quarry is simply better at this than he is, that he would never collect on that particular paper by his own hand. What he offered Dutch Cordell that Thursday was not merely information, but a proposition that if Dutch's hired men could occupy the gunman's attention long enough in a fight of the Cordell's own making, Junger himself might find an opening he'd never get chasing the man alone across open country. Dutch, who trusted paid men only exactly as far as their usefulness ran, agreed to the arrangement without much intending to honor his end of it once the shooting started. A small betrayal in waiting that would matter before the morning was through. He might have let it lie there, might have counseled his brother to swallow the humiliation and let the stranger ride on, except that Emmett, drunk and wounded in his pride past the point of sense, had by then convinced himself of something considerably more dangerous, which was that Josie herself had somehow arranged the whole humiliation, had smiled at the stranger, had wanted the interruption, had been, in Emmett's twisted accounting, unfaithful in some manner that justified whatever came next. He said as much to Dutch over supper that Thursday, and Dutch, who cared nothing for his brother's marriage, but cared a great deal for the Cordell name, told him plainly that if the drifter truly was the gunman the clipping described, the smartest thing any Cordell could do was let the matter die quiet. Emmett did not want it to die quiet. Emmett wanted more than he had wanted anything in some years, to be a man again in his own house and his own town, and he told his brother that Friday night that he intended to finish In his words, what he'd started on the church steps, whatever it cost him. Josie did not know any of this conversation had happened, not the clipping, not Dutch's counsel, not her husband's drunken vow, but she knew the shape of Emmett's moods well enough by then to feel the house going dangerous around her that Friday, a particular quality of quiet that had preceded the worst nights of her marriage, and it was that Friday evening. With Emmett gone to his brother's ranch and not expected back till morning, that she finally did the thing she had not let herself do in 2 years of careful survival, which was to walk, in the blue dusk, straight to the boarding house on 3rd Street, and knock. Wade opened the door with his hand not quite on his gun, but close enough that Josie noticed it, and when he saw who stood on the step, his whole posture changed, some readiness draining out of his shoulders replaced by a stillness that felt, to Josie, like the first safe quiet she had stood inside in longer than she could easily remember. She had not planned what to say. She said, in the end, only that she was afraid, and that she did not know afraid of what exactly, only that something in the house had gone wrong in a new way, worse than the old ways. And that she had nobody left in Split Creek, she trusted enough to say so to, except a stranger who had put his own neck out for her on a church step, for no reason she could yet account for. Wade told her the truth then, because he had decided, standing in that doorway, that she'd earned it more than his own safety was worth protecting. His name, he admitted, wasn't only Wade, that it had been other things in other territories, and that the newspapers had put a bounty on the other names that would keep a certain kind of man chasing him for the rest of his natural life, and that her husband's brother had almost certainly by now worked out exactly who he was. Which meant the quiet the town had enjoyed all week was very likely about to end. He told her this not to frighten her further, but because he thought she deserved to choose, with full knowledge, what came next, whether to go back to Cattleman's Row and wait it out the way she'd waited out 2 years of worse, or to let him do what he now believed, with a certainty that surprised him, he had ridden into Split Creek to do. Josie asked him, in the small silence after, whether he made a habit of it, stepping into other people's wars. Wade told her that he'd spent years running from exactly that habit, that every town he passed through, he told himself he'd keep his head down and ride on, and that every town, sooner or later, put something in front of him he couldn't ride past, and that Split Creek had put her in front of him on a Sunday morning, and he hadn't been able to ride past that either. It was, for a man who spoke as rarely as Wade did, close to a confession, and Josie heard it as one. And something passed between them in that doorway that was not yet love, was maybe only the recognition of two people who had each spent years surviving something alone, but it would, in the weeks that followed, in whatever weeks were left to them, grow into something neither of them had expected to find in a town like Split Creek. Dutch Cordell rode into town Saturday morning with 4 hired men and his brother Emmett riding a half-length behind, sober for once and pale with a fear even his pride couldn't quite mask, because Dutch had explained to him overnight, in blunt and ungentle language, and Emmett had spent the night since torn between a coward's wish to apologize his way out of the whole business and a proud man's terror of what apologizing would cost him in front of a town that had watched him humiliated once already. Dutch had no such conflict. Dutch's plan was simple and had worked for him in rougher country than Split Creek, which was to have his hired men brace the stranger somewhere without witnesses. Somewhere the tidy fiction of a town's law wouldn't have to account for what happened, and settle the matter permanently before word of a Cordell backing down from a wanted gunman could travel any further than it already had. Wade had expected exactly this because he had spent years learning to expect exactly this, and he had spent Friday night not sleeping, but planning the old cold competence coming back into him like a language he'd tried to forget and found he still spoke fluently. He moved Josie, before dawn Saturday, to the one place in Split Creek he judged safest, the small back room behind Odalise Pruitt's laundry, where the widow kept a shotgun of her own and a grudge against the Cordells old enough to make her trustworthy, who had shown up at the livery before light, with a rifle of his own and a boy's fierce insistence on being counted in whatever came next, to stay close to the church and the boarding house and watch, but not to draw unless Wade himself went down. Because Wade had no wish to see a 19-year-old buried over a fight that was rightfully his and no one else's. The confrontation came at mid-morning on the wide dirt stretch between the boarding house and the feed store, in view of half the town going about its Saturday errands, and there was no ceremony to it, no slow walk of gunfighters into an empty street the way the dime novels told it. Only Dutch Cordell's 4 hired men fanning out from their horses with the practiced unhurry of men who'd done this kind of work before, and Wade standing on the boarding house porch with his hat low and his hands loose at his sides, wanting badly by then to be anywhere else in the territory. Dutch called out first, offering Wade a chance to ride on peaceable, territory for territory. No hard feelings over a family matter that wasn't rightly his to have interfered in, and Wade answered that he'd ride on gladly the moment he had Dutch's word, that Josie Cordell would never again answer for another man's temper with her own body, and that if that word couldn't be given, there was nothing peaceable left to discuss. Dutch laughed at that, an ugly disbelieving sound, because in his experience, words given in a dirt street meant exactly as much as a man's willingness to enforce them and no more, and he told his hired men, without further ceremony, to finish it. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds, though everyone who watched it would swear afterward it felt considerably longer, the way violence does to people unused to it. Wade moved first and moved once, and 2 of Dutch's men were down before the other's guns had cleared leather, hit clean through the shoulder, and the gun arm in a manner that would leave them alive and considerably wiser, because Wade had made his peace in his years of running correctly that these particular 4 men were hired for money and not for hatred, and money men reconsidered their arithmetic fast once the cost became visible. The 3rd man got a shot away that went wide into the feed store's siding, and then threw down his pistol without being asked twice. The 4th was Silas Yone, and Junger alone among them did not fire wide or think better of the arithmetic because Junger had not ridden into Split Creek to collect a Cordell's wage. He had ridden in for the paper on Wade's own head, and he used the chaos of the first 3 shots to angle himself clear of Dutch's men entirely and level his rifle from behind a water trough, a position Wade hadn't accounted for because he'd read Junger correctly as Dutch's higher and wrongly in that one crucial half-second as bound by the same half-hearted loyalty as the rest. It was Casper Rule watching from the church steps with his own rifle exactly where Wade had told him to keep it, who put a bullet through the stock of Junger's rifle before the bounty man could steady his aim close enough to Junger's hands to make him drop the ruined weapon and dive flat rather than press his luck further. And it was the one moment in the whole affair where Wade's plan very nearly failed him, undone by a debt collector's patience Wade himself had underestimated. Dutch Cordell, who had ridden into Split Creek certain of an easy victory, found himself instead standing alone in a dirt street, with 2 wounded men groaning at his feet, a bounty hunter face down in the dust who'd never been loyal to him in the first place. To be every bit as dangerous as the 18-month-old clipping had claimed, and possibly more so, because the clipping had never mentioned how little pleasure the man appeared to take in any of it, nor how the boy from the livery would put himself between a legend and a bushwhacker's bullet without being asked twice either. It was Emmett who broke first, not Dutch. Some ruined, cornered part of him, watching his brother's hired men bleed in the street over a fight. Emmett himself had started on a church step, out of nothing more than wounded pride, went for the pistol at his own hip, not with any plan Wade could afterward reconstruct. Only the blind animal panic of a man who has always solved his problems with his hands and can conceive of no other solution. Even as the walls close in, he got the gun clear of the holster. Wade's bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him half around before he dropped, a wound meant to stop rather than kill, because even then, even with everything Emmett Cordell had done, Wade found he had no taste for making Josie a widow by his own hand if there was any other way to end it, and there was. The town came out of its stillness all at once. After that, the way A held breath finally lets go, Sheriff Bramwell arriving too late to have prevented anything, and considerably too late to pretend any longer that Split Creek's law had ever truly served anyone, and Reverend Weir coming down from the church with his face gone the color of old ash, and a dozen townsfolk who had spent 2 years finding the dirt fascinating whenever Emmett Cordell raised his voice, now finding they had a great deal to say about it now that saying it carried no cost. Dutch Cordell, disarmed and considerably humbled, agreed on the spot, with his brother bleeding in the street and 2 hired men groaning beside him, to whatever terms Wade cared to name, and Wade named few, only that the Cordell family's business interests in Split Creek, that the town's law would finally trouble itself to notice a woman's bruises the next time it saw them, and that Emmett Cordell, once healed enough to travel, would sign whatever paper his wife's lawyer. Josie came out from behind Odalise Pruitt's laundry once the shooting had stopped and word reached her it was over, and she walked the length of Bannock Street past a town that had spent 2 years looking away from her and now could not look at anything else, and she did not go to the sheriff either. She went to Wade, standing on the boarding-house porch with his gun already holstered, and a stillness on his face that Josie had come, in 1 short week, to recognize as the particular exhaustion of a man who hated what his hands were good for even when they'd done exactly the good they were needed for. She did not thank him in front of the crowd. She only stood beside him a moment, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and said, quiet enough that it carried to him and no one else, that she believed, for the first time in longer than she could account, that the house on Cattleman's Row was no longer the whole of her world. The weeks that followed were not, in any storybook sense, simple ones. Emmett Cordell healed slow and left the territory ahead of a warrant. Bramwell finally found the spine to swear out, the town's belated justice arriving, as it so often does, well after the worst of the damage was already done. And Dutch Cordell retreated to the Verde with his hired men and a diminished reputation that would follow him longer than any of his cattle contracts. Reverend Weir preached a different kind of sermon the following Sunday, one about the sin of a comfortable silence. And whether he preached it from genuine reckoning or simple self-preservation, Josie never troubled herself to ask, because she had stopped in those weeks, needing the town's good opinion to know her own worth. Dr. Fielding, for his part, made good on the quiet promise he'd made his wife, and when Bramwell finally came around asking after the true nature of injuries logged 18 months and a year past, Fielding told him plainly what his ledger had been too frightened to say the first time, and if that honesty came a year late, and it mattered a good deal to Josie, who had not known until Odalus told her that a doctor in town had finally chosen truth over comfort on her behalf. The town itself did not transform overnight into the decent place its better citizens liked afterward to claim it had always secretly been. There were those in Split Creek, plenty of them, who muttered for months that Josie Cordell had brought a gunman's trouble down on a peaceable town and ought to have borne her marriage the way better women bore worse, and Josie heard enough of that muttering second-hand, did not reopen merely because the facts had finally come out in her favor. But there were others, more than she expected, who found some overdue courage in the weeks after. Women who stopped her on Bannock Street to say quietly that they were glad. Farmers' wives who had buried their own version of Josie's story for 20 years and never once said it aloud until they saw a town forced to watch one woman's finally spoken plain. The dirt outside a church. Odalise Pruitt told her once over the mending that a single loud truth in a quiet town was worth more than it looked like at first, because it gave other women permission to remember their own truths. She and Wade spent that autumn in a slow, careful courtship that neither of them named aloud for some while, built less on declarations than on the accumulation of small trust. He taught her to shoot a pistol one gray afternoon out past the Rule place, standing behind her with his hands correcting the set of her elbow, and she surprised them both by how quickly her aim came true, as though some buried part of her had been waiting 2 years for permission to hold something. There was a supper at Odalus Pruitt's crowded little table, where Wade, ordinarily a man who measured out his words like a rationed thing, found himself telling a long, half-comic story about a mule he'd once owned in the Nations that refused to cross any water it hadn't personally inspected first. And Josie laughed so hard at the telling of it that Odalise had to set down her fork, and it was the first time in longer than Josie could measure that she had laughed without some watchful part of herself listening first for Emmett's step on the porch. There was a Sunday ride out along the Verde, where the cottonwoods had gone the color of old gold, and Josie, cresting a rise ahead of him, turned back to find Wade watching her with an expression she hadn't yet learned to name. After a long quiet that he had spent so many years being the thing that arrived after the trouble was already done, that he'd forgotten a person could also simply be glad, uncomplicatedly, of another person's company, with no debt or danger attached to the gladness at all. She did not tell him that day that she loved him, and he did not tell her either, because both of them understood, without needing to say it, that the words would carry a weight neither was yet ready to set down in a town still settling its accounts, but the knowing sat between them anyway, quiet and certain as the turning leaves. Caspar Rule, who had loved her hopelessly and said nothing for years, found he could finally be glad of it, because the gladness of watching someone healed mattered more to him, in the end, than the old ache of wanting her for himself, and that was its own kind of growing up. He told Odalus once, a little rueful, that he supposed he'd always known Josie Ansett was never going to be his, not really, but that he was grateful, at least, that whatever man finally did right by her turned out to be one who'd bled for the privilege in the open street where the whole town could see the cost of it, rather than one who'd simply been handed her the way Emmett had been handed her, cheap and easy, by two fathers settling a debt. But Wade knew, even in the sweetest of those autumn weeks, that a man with his name in 3 territories wanted bills could not stay in one town long without bringing the next, Silas Junger, and the one after that, to Split Creek's door. and that a woman who had only just learned to stand in daylight without flinching deserved a life that did not require her forever after to be the gunslinger's woman, watched and whispered over, waiting always for the next bounty man to come looking. He told her this, plainly, the way he told her everything by then. On the last evening before he rode north to finish the business in Flagstaff that had first brought him through Split Creek, and Josie, who had grown considerably less afraid of hard truths than the woman who'd knocked on his door in the blue dusk of a frightened Friday, told him she understood, and that she would not ask him to stay and become a target parked permanently in her front yard, but that she would remember for whatever years were left to her that a stranger had once crossed a churchyard for no reason but that a wrong was being done in front of him. One Split Creek's whole silent congregation had never thought to offer her. He rode out at first light, north toward Flagstaff, and whatever came after, and Josie stood on the boarding house porch and watched him go until the dust settled back over the road. And if there was an ache in it, there was also, for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, a future in it, too. One she intended to build herself, on her own name, in a town that had finally been made to look at what it had spent 2 years refusing to see. If this story found something true in you tonight, do me the kindness of hitting that like button before you go, and subscribe if you want more of these, because Wade's Road runs through a great many towns like Split Creek, and every one of them has its own reckoning coming. Josie Cordell filed her petition that winter and had it granted by spring, the first such petition Split Creek's court had ever granted a woman without a single objection raised, and she took back her father's name and, in time, a share of the mercantile her father had signed away in fear years before. And she never again let a town's comfortable silence stand between her and the truth of her own life. She never saw Wade again, not in any way the county records would note, though there were those in Split Creek who swore, years later, that a quiet rider passed through every autumn around the same week, tipped his hat to a woman minding a mercantile counter. Maybe that's true, and maybe it's only the kind of story a town tells itself once it's ashamed of the silence that came before. But I like to think it's true, because some debts once paid, and that's the story of Josie Cordell and the stranger who stepped between her and a fist, and a town that finally learned, one Sunday too late for some things and just in time for others, that looking away is its own kind of choosing. Thank you for riding along with me tonight. If you want more stories like this, one The Nameless Drifters, The Reckonings Nobody Saw Coming, subscribe and I'll see you on the next road.